Episode 56, Wheat and Barley, the Rise of 18th Century American Milling Tech. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at how some of the first examples of American ingenuity really arose while the US of A was still British colonies, and how much of this early kit bashing of well-established old world technology was tied to the production of food, grain food especially. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the food things the early colonists universally missed were wheat bread and barley beer, and probably pie. But today isn't about specific food items. Rather, it's about the tech that started to emerge in the 18th century that will eventually turn the North American continent into the literal breadbasket for different parts of the globe in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And this topic feels a bit timely as we are once again facing some of the same grain supply issues that were troubling Europe and other parts of the world in the 17th and 18th centuries. Crop failures due to disrupted weather patterns, grain shipments scrambled by war, and the sudden inflation of food prices. Some destinations are inescapable when you travel well-trodden roads. The modern world runs on grain, by humans eating corn or rice or oats or wheat, etc., directly, as well as using it to feed the fish, fowl, beef, and pork we consume, and as a major part of the fodder for dairy products we enjoy. But the pre-mechanized world may have run even more on grain, for grain is one of the very few foodstuffs that can be easily harvested in excess and then stored for years to stave off the shortage or even famine people of the pre-modern age always expected around the next bend of time. And it fed the transport and muscle power of the horses and oxen that made travel and agriculture at anything above human power and speed possible. For an extended walk through all the steps required to go from seed to flour, head back to episode 20 where I covered that. What we really need to remember now is that grain was a popular, nay, essential food for the survival and expansion of humankind, and that until machines came into play in the 19th century, cutting, drying, and busting wheat and barley out of their grain heads is going to remain more or less handwork. But turning grain, once it has been winnowed from the chaff into flour, that was ready for some serious New World, you're not the boss of me innovations. However, before I get into flour processing innovation, let's take a tour of grain grinding and the mechanical mill so we can see what the 18th century advancements mean. I probably should have made this a two-parter, a history of, and then 18th century, blah, blah, blah. But instead, you just have a longish episode, so let's go. Grains have been eaten by humans long before we were farming them as agricultural societies. Seeds of many sorts have been part of our diet since, well, before we were modern humans. And what much of the modern dietary myth-making around a certain current fad seems to forget is that one doesn't go from no grains at all to suddenly plowing up fields with shell-bladed hand hoes or once trusty oxen and creating a grain-centered diet. Instead, there's a progression of finding wild stands of grain, then doing some agricultural engineering to encourage grain patches, and harvesting them where they like to grow, to finally clearing ground and setting up fields. Even in the early 20th century, this sort of engineering areas to grow a favored grain, rather than creating a cultivated and planted farm field, was still going on in North America by First Nations tribes along the Great Lakes. The growing and harvesting of wild rice, which, in fact, in just a very few places, still goes on today. So this whole thing of pre-agricultural people not eating grain, that's not even a little true. Within the mix of the myriad other plant foods and the occasional animals they were consuming, they had to be eating grains and seeing the benefits of processing and storing them in order to go to all the trouble of developing agriculture. For as much as some people love to bash the sheer effort that agricultural societies had to marshal to be successful and stable, as compared to the apparently smaller amount of time hunter-gatherer societies would spend hunting and gathering each meal, they seem to conveniently forget how much hunting and gathering time was unsuccessful, how much learning and practice and failure went into each successful meal, and most of all, how tenuous that existence was when followed all the year round, and how short life became when an individual couldn't keep up with the moving of camps and chasing and the gathering required. Grains allowed us to start being old, and to care and include individuals who are not directly producing food in our lives. The archaeology is really clear about that. The first grains we consumed with our puny human teeth were definitely whole grains, either popped in fires, as in the early popcorn in South America, or soaked and cooked in porridges. Somewhere along the way, it was determined that smashing the whole grains made things more versatile. Among other things, this killed the germ and stopped stored grain from sprouting, and it allowed the grain to cook faster and be useful for more things. For a very long time, pounding grain between two hard surfaces, usually stone on stone, was the way to break down grains, though very hard woods did come into play with more fragile grains like rice. Somewhere in the last few centuries BCE, the use of one flat stone rotating over another to grind grain, rather than pounding or back and forth sliding, came into use, and from that, mechanical innovations began to flow. Using draft animals, likely initially domesticated oxen, to walk across grain to loosen the outer husk or chaff was an early use of non-human power in grain processing. Having draft animals, possibly oxen or donkeys, rotate one millstone over another was another application of non-human power to the grain processing problem. But it is the control of water, irrigation, the moving it from here to there, pumping it uphill, holding it in ponds for later, and governing particular flow rate, which are all well documented in Central Asia and Egypt, as well as in China and South America, that makes the biggest mechanical jump in food production. And this was all over the world. Harnessing water power was well-known tech everywhere. There were people engaged in agriculture. Using gears and pulleys and wheels to transfer power from wind and water got played with in multiple places as sailing ships and dikes and dams and canals were developed over and over and over again by different coastal peoples. After all, these mills were machines of carved and fitted wood and dressed or shaped stone, technology that has been independently invented in multiple places and at multiple times. Based on the dwellings, churches, temples, and fortifications of the first millennium BCE, these were several technologies that reached high levels of competency and specialization in multiple places. It was the leap of imagination of turning water or wind power, moving along a single direction or vector, into angular momentum or spinning that had to happen. The first remaining records of connecting water power to a stone wheel for grinding grain in Europe that I could find lie in ancient Greece. Those torched libraries of Alexandria likely held so many more clues, and I'm sure there are plenty of other traces in documents not translated into English. Sigh. Anyway, the Romans and their capture of the Greek city-states made note of this mechanical method for grinding grain and ran with it. After all, they were holding down wholesale popular revolts of farmers kicked off their lands by greedy oligarchs with mass distributions of grain. So coming up with ways to process the grain for the masses and for their sprawling military machine was a very enticing idea. These soldiers couldn't spend all day grinding grain to make their daily bread. They had to stand around occupied cities looking tough. The Romans once again proved that editing is always easier than coming up with whole new ideas. When they picked up the Greek water wheel design, they made some improvements. The Greek design was typically a vertical shaft anchored in the ground with a wheel that spun around it horizontally. Translating the single direction motion of the water into a spinning grain crusher is an impressive leap of engineering logic. But the Romans saw a way to use the weight of the water wheel itself to help the mill be more efficient. They appear to have come up with the plan of a horizontal shaft and a vertically oriented wheel. To the Roman credit, there is some serious structural engineering required to hold that horizontal shaft and allow a big, heavy wooden wheel to spin freely on it. So it seems that the same grain-fed brains that came up with the aqueducts also came up with this horizontal shafted vertical wheel design. Which means the Romans, along with grapes and wines and olives, Baths, oil, and amphitheaters were also planting these water-powered grain mills around their empire. Now, as far as our story is concerned, the important date is that the first one appears in Britain sometime in the 1st century CE, and the Roman design received at least one update from the big city in the 4th century CE. Unfortunately, by the time Rome was distributing water-powered grain mills to the frontier outposts, it wasn't the engineers, philosophers, and cooks in charge of government policy and determining how to spend money to impress the populace. Instead, it was a bunch of murderously competitive rich guys playing Who Poisons Who, so I have the biggest house now, along with others who just wanted to draw the biggest crowds to their events. So the mills fell to rack and ruin and would only start to reappear in any meaningful way in Europe when writing started to get fashionable again around the 13th century. Interestingly enough, the European rebirth of watermills appears to have started with iron processing and then worked their way back over to grain milling. Partly, I would guess, because metal tools, courtesy of the iron mills, made the stone dressing necessary to make really nice large millstones much easier. Over the centuries, the size of the millstones grew until they could weigh up to a ton, 2,000 pounds or about 1,000 kilos each. They moved at faster and faster speeds until they topped out around 120 rotations per minute. And the grooves in the stones became increasingly complex. Curved cuts were developed that ground more of the grain in a more regular fashion on the first pass and moved the ground grain to the edge of the stone so grinding could be continuous. The job of the millwright was a skilled profession that required decades of apprenticeship, knowing which woods to use for each element of the mill, where hardness was needed, where flexibility was required, which elements should take where, and which pieces of machinery were in positions that made replacement nearly impossible, are examples of the complex knowledge a millwright would need to learn. The base of nearly every mill was built of stone block. They had to be leveled and settled to unshifting steadiness before the rest of the mill could be placed upon them, including, most crucially, the bottom millstone, which had to be dead level. The second stone was placed atop it. This was the one hooked to the watermill, or sometimes the windmill, and spun to grind the grain. The stone dressing or stone shaping was an art unto itself. First, stones had to be chosen from a material that was of the correct hardness and consistent composition. Then flat surfaces had to be made by hand and eye. To put into context the exactness these mills had to be leveled and stable to, think about the thickness of a wheat grain or a piece of corn or a barley grain or an oat. 2 multi-100-pound stones spinning around twice a second had to be far enough apart to not touch, which would introduce grit into the flour, wear them down even faster, and produce heat that would scorch and thus ruin the grits or flour. So they would need to be not touching and yet close enough so they could grind something the thickness of a grain. Thinking about how tight those tolerances were and that they were adjusting those by eye is mind-boggling. And it underscores what a highly skilled and valued profession millwright was. It also makes it clear why millwright was a profession a family could be built around for several generations. To obtain these exacting mechanical standards, there were tools that were used to check their work, one of which was a straight stick covered with clay to mark high spots. In the 18th century colonies, such a thing was called a red stick, due to it being rubbed with red clay that would easily brush off visibly on uneven spots. Also of note, the practice of eyeing a straight line was inherited from architectural practice, but also from weapons construction, in building spears, swords, and arrows. Anyway, let's move back to the North American colonies. By the time we are in the middle of the 18th century, there are plantations and farm families all up and down the coast that have been in residence for up to 100 years. People could trace their residence in the New World back 3 or 4 or 5 generations. Quite a few people were starting to think of themselves as Americans, maybe British Americans or Prussian or Swedish or French or Dutch Americans, but overall as a people who were really starting to think about themselves in terms of being residents of their daughter colonies instead of the temporary inhabitants meant to make their fortune and then return home to the mother city, which is a very different way of thinking compared to many of the 17th century colonists. Many of them thought of making their fortunes in the colonies and then returning home. By the time mills, wind and water, were being built, people had familiarity with the local tree species. What kind was best for the wheel shaft? White oak, by the way. What kind of wood was best for building the wheel flanges? Hickory, typically. And what wood types were best for other parts like gear wheels, gear pins and teeth, levers and block. And by the 18th century, being able to design, commission, and judge iron parts for the mills as well. As we looked at in episode 43, more iron processing was happening in North America, due to the need to have metal parts on hand in order to fight the French and plunder the Spanish ships, etc. London had lightened up on its embargo around processing metal end-to-end on colonial shores, so the metal parts needed in the modern, updated, more efficient 18th century mills could be made to order as needed. In fact, with more blacksmiths and more steps of the metal part manufacturing trade on North American shores, experimental designs could start to be made. This also made the mining tools and the picks for dressing the millstones cheaper, and they could also be custom made to a user's experimental specifications. The stones themselves were a different matter. Some were made of locally quarried stone when appropriate rocks could be found, but some mill builders would import millstones from Europe. France seemed to be an especially popular source. For dressing the large millstones was as specialized a work as building the mills themselves. When it came to building and working mills in the North American colonies, there were three main ways it happened. The first type was mostly found in the northern and mid-Atlantic colonies where more of the communal religious bent prevailed. These were mills built more or less by and for a community. An owner-operator would live on the premises, and while it was no way to get rich, it was a good living. This sort of mill was generally called a customs mill, where each farmer would pay money or a portion of their grain as a fee to use the mill. It would be an independent operation and usually served farmers within a 5 to 10 mile radius of the mill. Possibly members of the community that had helped to build the mill could receive different rates than farmers outside the community. Grain ground at such a mill would be for the use of the farmers who might sell their own surplus, and this model of mill economics was a shifted reflection of the mills in Europe built by landlords. There, the local peasants would use the mill to grind grain for their own use, and a portion of the grain would be kept by the miller, who was typically an employee of the landlord, as a toll for using the mill. There were some free towns that had mill models exactly like these, but the estate mill that charged for the use by the surrounding peasants was the most typical version. Depending on the size of the miller's family, the mill might employ only other close and extended family members or bring in other workers, indentured servants, or slaves. The second type of mill would be built on a large plantation with the goal of primarily providing for the plantation only. The people who worked in the mill would either be employees of or property of the plantation. The produce of the mill would be exclusively for the use of the plantation and would generally not be sold for profit. For example, George Washington had separate milling operations, an estate mill to provide for the needs of the plantation, and then another one to grind grain for sale. Estate mills were also a close reflection of the estate mills of Europe, and while the peasant might have freedom to dispose of the produce they did not owe to the landlord more or less as they wished, the American plantations owned most of those working on them outright. So the master of the plantation would also dictate the disposal of all of the produce. Enslaved workers had no say in how the flour or grits were distributed or consumed. The third type of mill, and these were the last sort to appear, were merchant mills. These purchased the grain from the farmers and ran mercantile operations to sell the flour themselves, either to the local population through a storefront or to other merchants who would pick up the flour and sail it in their vessels to other ports. This sort of operation was the least like anything to be found in Europe. Building and owning a growing mill and mercantile empire was the least European arrangement of all. The flour that was sold to other merchants was mostly shipped to ports along the North American coast and to ports in the Caribbean. Later, as surpluses increased, barrels of flour would start going back to Europe as damaging weather and war disrupted grain production around the continent. Flour and grain exports to Europe became such a large operation that in Boston, alongside the fishing boats being built specifically for cod and the fast slave ships being built to transport captive Africans, they were also building ships designed around shipping grain. So much grain growing, and especially wheat farming, was going on in the colonies by the middle of the 18th century that mills were popping up everywhere. A new mill from start to finish could be completed in as little as 14 months, though 2 years was a more typical timeline. Even as mills were being built at an astounding rate, there were also frequently mills for sale. It's hard to know if mills were being built on speculation by, say, a millwright in a likely spot to be sold so they might move on to the next project, or if it was more common for older men to be the ones to have the capital to be able to build mills, and then they died before they could establish the mill as a family business. In this case, their estate might want to sell the mill and move into different occupations. Generally, a widow was prohibited from running a mill or practically incapable due to the number of legal contracts she would have to enter into, and the contemporary structure of English law made it impossible for her to do so. She needed a father, a brother, a son, an uncle, or a cousin, anyway, some male relative to work as her representative. Otherwise, no matter how well she knew the business, she could not run a mill. More than one paper I have read makes the dubious claim that women, quote, happily gave up the responsibilities of milling as it became more mechanical and complex, unquote. Other patterns in American food development make it more likely that this is another example of men taking over women's work as they realized it was profitable. The ongoing project of removing money-making activities from women is a dependable and often repeated theme in American food development. Whether it be beer brewing, grain milling, dairy production, especially of butter and cheese, selling eggs and raising fowl for meat, baking, developing spice mixes, catering, and, well, the list goes on. And while many a person would argue, quote, men made it more efficient, unquote, it's important to remember only men were allowed to possess the capital and sign for the kind of contracts that allowed for the expansion and larger mechanization of these industries. As we saw back in beer making, plenty of male business owners acted as the front and profit collector while continuing to have women do the skilled labor. So anyway, whether as speculative projects by enterprising millwrights or due to the need to clear up estates, mills were often for sale and available alongside the rash of mills being built all up and down the colonies. And building or buying a mill at this time was not folly. The cultivation of grains, corn, wheat, barley, and oats were all expanding, and in the never-before-cultivated rich soil of central Pennsylvania and the Hudson and Delaware valleys, farmers were seeing yields per acre unknown back in the crowded fields of England and Europe. To help with the cultivation of the ever larger fields in all this open New World land, the metal-tipped and full metal plowshares were coming into use. The loosening of the rules about finishing iron in the colonies not only meant metal parts for the mills, it also meant metal parts for the plows. Probably the most important part of all of this for the farmers was that locally made plowshares were far more affordable than the imported items had been. And we'll return to those metal plowshares in future episodes, since their local manufacture also opened the way for more innovation of them as well, in both design and metallurgy. For now, what it really meant was the end of the wooden harrow of the old world. The criss-cross method of plowing and hand broadcasting of grain were also being challenged. It is in the 18th century when row-planted grains and the ideas for seed drills started to emerge. And this is all supported by the rise of the colonial dairy scene, which meant there were plenty of oxen to be hitched to plows. While grain growing presented its own set of challenges in the world of millwright and the miller, situating the head race, the water supply into the wheel, was their biggest first challenge. More than one milling operation was ruined as floods or ice flows broke apart the works that fed the water supply into the wheel. And because setting that up cost so much effort, it was common for the custom mills and merchant mills to attach a sawmill operation to the same wheel. In the 18th century, those sawmills would do the heavy, unspecialized work of cutting wood for clapboards and building timbers for export. The specialized woodworking for things like shipbuilding, barrel making, shingles, and furniture were still done by hand, though some of the prep work of cutting trees down to size might be done at the mills, especially if, say, a barrel maker had a shop close to a merchant mill that made grain and sawed wood. Because transporting grain was such an important part of the food and economic life of the colonies, Pennsylvania and North, roads finally started to develop. Some of the earliest maintained turnpikes in the colonies were centered around the transport of grain, both to the custom mills and to the merchant mills. The concentration of milling and flour shipping along the Brandywine River in Pennsylvania, the Hudson River in New York, and the Delaware River in New Jersey all left marks by the way of the arrangement of townships today. The fact that mills in the southern colonies tended to serve plantations rather than communities is partly reflected in the general lack of early major road development. Cargo transport tended to take place almost exclusively on rivers. Paths and road tended to be for foot and horse traffic and not for the transport of goods. Along with roads, the other mark mills made were in law. Many a village and town built both the church and the mill early on. Though more than one community held worship in homes or in a roughly thrown-together municipal building, deeming a mill the higher priority than an impressive church. Establishing a town, a mill, and then rules was a common occurrence. Some of the first laws on colonial books have to do with rules about milling, and mostly about milling wheat. Fines for cheating on flour quality, mixing grains, rules about what could be charged for milling, and so on. These laws were being developed right alongside the servant and slave codes. For these colonists, food and labor were the two topics most in need of regulation. A large proportion of the rules around wheat flour quality were self-enforced. This, of course, worked because there were consequences for cheating. Not only would people stop buying from you, but your whole region might get shunned by wheat purchasers. So now your neighbors were mad at you too. In the early part of the 18th century, as the Pennsylvania farmers were being set up, Baltimore as a more plantation-based area and New York's Hudson Valley simply as a much older establishment, each had the better reputations for producing better wheat flour. Between 1700 and 1740, Pennsylvania was actually known as an exporter of crude iron. To counteract this perception, Pennsylvania passed the Flour Inspection Act of 1722. It laid out rules around the production, labeling, and to a certain extent pricing of the flour they produced. This act and its consistent enforcement lifted Pennsylvania into the premier spot as a flour producer. This was in the interest of not just the farmers, but also the merchant mills popping up along the Brandywine River and the transatlantic merchants doing business out of Philadelphia. So by the middle of the 18th century, wheat farming and milling had increased to the point where instead of being a wheat importer or just a bunch of poor colonists reduced to eating ground corn items, the colonies were now wheat exporters. But even in the face of plenty of food and land, the colonies were still suffering from labor shortages. And the plantation owners, they wanted to keep as much of their purchased labor on the most remunerative tasks. They didn't want to waste slave bodies on mundane things like hauling grain around during the milling tasks. They wanted cash-producing work, so their efforts could be expended in the tobacco, indigo, and rice fields, or in arenas where slaves might be displays of power, so used to keep linens and houses spotless or to produce meals of impressive length, variety, and flavor. It's not for nothing that Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, the earliest extensive manifesto on capitalism, was published in 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence and the launch of the Revolutionary War. While the wealth in Europe was concentrating on stability and the ability to support or oppose the wars of their local monarchy, the adventurers who put down roots in the colonies were focused on disruption and changing things. European wealth largely saw continued, if updated, feudalism as the way of the future. Innovation was more typically seen as pernicious, and what little that was allowed should be limited to things that added to the comfort and enjoyment of us, the educated, wealthy people who, mattered. Education for and consideration of the little people was still a fairly foreign concept in the 18th century. Leading social theories leaned hard on the idea that people had their places and would be much happier if they knew their places and simply accepted them. A real up-and-comer might join the clergy or the military, but wholesale societal changes to introduce things like access to clean water, adequate nutrition, and education for the masses, well, that way lay madness. Meanwhile, in the colonies, even with the limited vision of the people in charge, there was still a sense that men of ability could advance in the world, even if they were Presbyterian, Catholic, Quaker, or shudder, Anglican, even if they were orphans or bastards, and not like the fun kind, secret babies of royalty. I mean, depending on how tight labor was, it might get to the point where women and freed slaves might get paid for the work. As I said, it was utter madness in the colonies. And in this swirl of new ideas, there was a sense that work for pay was the way things were going to get done. Despite several 17th century attempts at instituting a new feudalism in the New World, there was just too much work to be done and too much land people could just pick up and move away to. So the idea that rewarding innovation that made work more efficient and, get this, paying people to do it so that more innovation might happen started to become a particularly American way of thinking as Adam Smith was getting all his ideas down on paper. America's going to play at mercantilism for a while, but innovation and paying for labor, one way or another, were part of the colonies and then the country from the start. America had the ideology of capitalism woven into its beginnings in a way that was unique among countries founded and republics declared in the 18th century. The way this came out in 18th century colonial milling was not in any radical redesign of mills around power transfer or stone design. The big innovations came in the area of the use of human labor. While the most mindless part of milling, the grinding of grain, was about as optimized as it could get in the first half of the 18th century, the management of the grain before and after it went through the grindstones, that's where there was room for innovation. A regular-sized 17th or 18th century grain mill required 4 or 5 hardy young men or formidable daughters or daughters-in-law to keep it running smoothly. No 18th century miller would be caught dead hiring a woman for a wage, but would definitely include women in their labor force if they were part of the family. Okay, scratch that. Enslaved women that had been paid for were likely included in milling crews, but regardless, 4 or 5 hardy young persons was the proper number to run a mill. The jobs within the mill were as follows: hauling the grain to the top of the mill, pouring the grain into the stones at the proper rate, collecting and raking and cooling the newly ground flour or grits, bolting or sifting the grits or flour to separate it into grades, and then packing the flour into sacks or barrels depending on its destination. Many of these operations were ripe for automation, and in the innovation-friendly New World, that's just what happened. The grinding had to happen down near the base of the mill. I mean, those stones were unwieldy and heavy. No one wanted to spend all the time building an upper floor that could hold them. That was why sacks of grain had to be hauled to the top of the mill. Over time, systems of blocks or pulleys were developed, saving tiring climbs up ladders or steep stairs with a 70-pound or 30-kilo grain sack across the shoulders. Soon the motive power of the mill was hooked up to this early grain elevator. The next operation up for automation was the pour into the center of the stones. Some of the first automated innovations included different governors on large bins that regulated the stream of this grain. This let one person simply empty grain sacks into a large tank and walk away, instead of painstakingly pouring grain into the stones at the correct rate. Next up for innovation was with flour handling as it left the stones. Grinding flour is a high friction operation, so as the flour leaves the stones, it is hot. It's also damp. Grain that makes good flour, it comes from seeds that still contain moisture inside their seed coat. And in this age, some of the bran kernels, the part that contains the heart of the seed, and a store of fats, got partly crushed in the grinding. So this hot, newly damp, and lightly oily flour needed to be cooled and dried. Normally a job for a small boy, the mechanical rake that replaced him in an attempt to solve the chronic labor shortage would be called a hopper boy. Raking the flour to cool it down and dry it was essential for two reasons. Flour packed too warm and still damp would go rancid quickly. Also, damp flour could clog up the bolting or sifting cloths in the next step. The bolting step was a heavy and mind-numbingly repetitive task. Setting up a series of cloth trays that shook to sift the flour was a straightforward automation to devise for people as intimately familiar with millworks as the millwrights and the millers. The stages of bolting would separate out bran, loose husks, and incompletely ground grains that needed to be sent back through the mill. It also created grades of flour from the finest powder for cakes and tarts to coarser stuff for daily bread and sickroom gruel. Separating bran from flour is what takes whole wheat flour and makes it white flour. Bakers and merchants both prefer this flour. Merchants because the absence of bran means it is more shelf stable for a longer time at room temperature. The lack of the oils in the bran prevents rancidity for longer. Bakers prefer it both because it doesn't go rancid as quickly. Longer storage is good for them too. But they also like it because white flour loaves can be lighter and rise higher. The oil in the bran reduces the elasticity of the dough, and the bran itself has sharp edges, so it tears the dough and pops the bubbles necessary for the very lightest and airiest loaves. In fact, the rise of the 18th century water and windmills with their included bolting operations created bran as a byproduct of milling flour. Stone pounding grains or grinding them with a hand quern does not produce large amounts of separate bran. Whole wheat flour is the product and was used as such, unless some flour was specially separated out for a particularly fine cake. But with the spread of the mechanical mills, which by the mid-18th century could turn out between 4,000 and 8,000 pounds or 2,000 and 4,000 kilos of grain in a day, white flour became more common and bran became a fairly ubiquitous byproduct. One use was to make bran mashes as part of the winter feed for livestock. This higher fat fodder would be important for keeping dairy cows in good health while they were pregnant, so their spring milk would come in abundance. Another widespread use of bran was to make molasses beer. Yes, exactly the stuff that I was talking about back in episode 45. Bran was a popular way to make terrible molasses beer slightly less terrible, but really only very slightly. While many beer inspirations have come from the 18th century into the 21st, persimmon beer, wild hop beer, even the occasional spruce or pumpkin beer, bran and molasses beer is noticeably absent. All of these innovations would at last come together in the work of one Oliver Evans of Wilmington, Delaware. In 1790, he applied for and was granted the third U.S. patent for these connected automations in his mill. Turns out, signing patents was initially a presidential duty. So George Washington got an early look at the Oliver Evans system and was one of the early adopters. Washington installed the Evans system in the commercial mill he built around 1794 on one of his plantation properties. Now, we'll eventually visit Washington's shift away from tobacco to grain baron in the post-revolutionary series, and that is the next one. But next week, we get to talk about pie. With the arrival, at last, of wheat flour for the masses, that old English favorite, pie can be made and enjoyed all over the North American British colonies. We'll talk about the why and the how and lots of savory kinds. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com, which, For those of you that are following along in real time, are finally all the way caught up. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference. They make me easier to find in all the podcast widgets. Questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on Twitter, where I'm most active. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bios at THOA Food and in the show description.